Good afternoon. Thank you. I hope all can find their seats. I think we're pretty full up, although there's some folks downstairs still looking to come in, so if you are looking for a seat, please grab one. Otherwise, we've got some other claimants. Anyway, I want to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Program. I want to welcome you, first of all, to the law school, and secondly, of course, to this evening's program in honor of the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King. Across our country, over the course of this long weekend, Dr. King's words will be rehearsed, his beautiful baritone voice that was so full of hope that the future would bring us will be heard again, and we will recall the personal sacrifices that he made, the continuity that he represented both in the Gandhian tradition of nonviolence and in the African American tradition of creative resistance. We'll think as well about the lives that were lost, some of which were recorded, and some mourned all over the world, like Dr. King himself, and many others who lost their lives who are invisible to this very day. And we'll think about what the significance of his legacy means for us today. This period, the Civil Rights era, continues to hold great imaginative power for us as Americans, in large part because it is not fully history, or at least not in the sense that World War I, the Great Depression, and even World War II are history. The marches are over, and Jim Crow is buried, but the Civil Rights era is still within the living memory of anyone over the age of, say, 40-ish. And I think there are some of those here today. Because we can remember where we were and what we were doing when Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th of 1968, we still mourn him even as we commemorate his life. But this, too, will pass. There will come a time, and it is not really so far off, when it will all be secondary sources. The stories will all have been told. Those who were killed while no one noticed will either remain invisible or will be resurrected. And the photographs and posters that are now stored in folks' basements will be discarded or archived. Civil rights will then be found in civil rights museums and on civil rights trails and in university libraries and classrooms. Indeed, we are not really that far away from the time, maybe it's a quarter of a century from now, when one can ask the question, I wonder what it was like to be a freedom rider, and there could be no living person who would be able to answer that question. This is the process by which events become history, and it is what we will be exploring this evening. It is that urgency to create a record that is true, a record that captures the factual truth, the forensic truth, the personal truth, the emotional and social truth. And here I am borrowing from South African Justice Albie Sachs' illuminating concept of a multi-layered truth. The many truths of the Civil Rights Movement and the Jim Crow South that produced it. This is where I believe our work here at CRRJ, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, folks remember that? Runs on a parallel path with that of Isabel Wilkerson. CRRJ provides legal assistance to families who suffered from racial violence and then endured the double burden of a legal system designed only for whites. Many of our dozens of cases are classic lynchings, such as the infamous case of Claude Neal, lynched in 1934 in Florida, and his story is recounted in Professor Isabel Wilkerson's book. We represent Claude Neal's great-nephew, who no longer lives in Florida, who is a migrant from that state, and who is now seeking relief from the state of Florida for what happened to his family member in 1934. In other cases, such as that of Earl Lipsey, who you'll hear from tonight, the violence they encountered was connected to their civil rights activism. But the plight of the victims of that violence never reached the headlines. Every one of our cases is a story of migration. These are people who ran literally to save their lives, who left behind the dead bodies of their loved ones, their businesses, their properties, anything to get to safety. More importantly for us, they also abandoned any hope of achieving justice in the places where they were wronged when they ran. CRRJ looks for relief whenever we can find it. Sometimes it's litigation, sometimes it's legislative intervention, and sometimes it's simply community commemoration. Our witnesses, when we can find them, and our students are on the road all over the country. These are folks who are now in their senior years. And hence, we must move quickly if we ought to reach them. And it strikes me that Professor Wilkerson also faced these same challenges in writing what is one of the most important books on the American experience to appear in many, many years. And so I invite all of you to sit back and to relax and to prepare to enjoy the evening and to join all of our guests and our students after the presentations are concluded at a reception downstairs where Professor Wilkerson will also be available to sign her book. Before I begin, I must acknowledge that we were fortunate to have as very active partners in the planning of this event our three co-sponsors from Northeastern University, the John D. O'Brien African American Institute, directed by Dr. Richard O'Brien, who is with us, and the Institute on Race and Justice, which is directed by Professor Jack McDevitt and also by Lisa Laguerre, who are both also with us. And from the Greater Boston area, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, directed by Norma Dapolitano. Thank you, Norma, for joining us and for bringing with you board members of the Lawyers Committee. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce a surprise guest, one for whom this is the second MLK event of the day. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Alun, president of our university, and please say a few words.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I don't know whether it's a real surprise, but I hope it is. Let me mention something that, Margaret, you have been doing superb work nationwide. And let me also welcome our guests and Professor Wilkerson. When I asked her, how long are you going to stay with us? She said, I don't know. That means that it's an open-ended invitation. I'll come back around June, and I hope to see you at the same seat. So welcome. Let me agree with everything you said, Margaret, except one thing. You said this is an American experience, and it's truly an American experience, but it's more too. I have to tell you, I was not raised in the United States. You can hear it from my accent, for those who, and don't comment on my accent, please. And growing up, I shared with some of us that the message of Dr. King was a universal message. And essentially, what we are celebrating, what you are celebrating, what we are all celebrating today is an American message, but also a universal message. And it is because it is such a deep-rooted American message that it impacted us all, and it allowed us to look at the world in a different way. Growing up in an environment, in a continent that was completely remote and completely different, the message of Dr. King was a message of hope, a message of justice, the message of empowerment, and the message of tolerance. Then I moved to another continent, and I was then the immigrant there. And from the first minute, I was asked to essentially find every single possible way to assimilate. And when I came to the United States, what was very surprising and in many ways liberating is that here, people from day one told me, we celebrate our roots, and we want you to celebrate yours and also merge them with the identity that is America. What do I mean by that? I mean by that in America, and I mentioned that to several of my colleagues, and I mentioned it this morning, so far as I know, that's the only place in the world where you can be hyphenated. You can be African American, you can be Jewish American, you can be Lebanese American, you can be Asian American. Choose it, you can do that, and we celebrate this. So the message of Dr. King is really a universal message. When I was growing up, I saw it as such. And frankly, over the years, this message was amplified, and it's more relevant forever, more relevant than anything I know. Because in many ways, if you travel all over the world, take a country, and they are trying to assimilate, to understand this message, and it hasn't been the case. Go to Asia, go to Europe, go to Latin America. The concept of having a hyphenated background is a concept that has been very difficult to fully integrate. And for me personally, this is what I lived. It's a universal message, and I frankly didn't realize the uniqueness of this message till I came to the United States. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for all our speakers. But please, your contributions are universal. And the contributions that we're celebrating today are universal. So thank you again for doing that. And thank you, Margaret, for organizing that.
Thank you, President Ayoun. Dean Emily Spieler also has a message of welcome for us. Dean Spieler is responsible for this room, this lovely room, and so many other things that have happened in this law school that have made it a new and vibrant and exciting place over the last 10 years. We are lucky to have her here with us today, and we at CRRJ are particularly lucky for the support that she has provided to our program from its very inception. Without her, we would not be able to do the work we do. And I also have to say that Dean Spiel not only has been a terrific leader for our law school, but has also been a national leader on the very messy and sometimes troubling and sometimes controversial questions of how best to achieve racial justice in our country. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome her here.
So it's my job to welcome you on behalf of the School of Law, but I want to back up just a minute because just last week I had the opportunity on a moonlit night, actually it was a full moon, to go to the new Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's an extraordinary experience to go there, both because it celebrates an important period in the history of our country and an important person, but also because it reminds us of important issues that still face us. And for me, it was definitely a reminder that we still have mountains to climb in the quest for justice in this country. That Martin Luther King Day and the celebration we have of his life is not simply a celebration of a single human being who did good works. It's a celebration of the efforts that he made and was making at the time of his death to achieve racial justice, and the understandings of what racial justice means in this country and the scope of social and economic justice that's required in order for us all to achieve, I think, the country that we hope to live in. This is a law school with a long commitment to seeking justice. It certainly long predates me. There are members of the faculty here who have been here since almost the founding of the law school in the late 1960s. And it has been a school that has graduated and championed the work of people who are working on the quest for justice for people who have been marginalized in our society, locally, nationally, and now internationally for many years. It is also a school that has, I would say, reveled in its collaborations outside the school with the Institute for Race and Justice and Criminal Justice, with other faculty around the university, and also with progressive members of the bar in Boston, including the Lawyers Committee, and outside of Boston. But we owe I think there's a special place and a special thanks to give to Margaret Burnham, who brought her history and her passion for justice to the law school a decade ago and created the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. It's work that matters. It matters for the people with whom the project works, the individuals who you can read about in the brochure. It's work that matters for our students in extraordinary ways, as they have the personal opportunity to connect with people whose lives have been affected by the troubling and violent history of this country. I think that we owe a tremendous thanks to Margaret for this work and for what it's meant for our students and the rest of our faculty, and for bringing us together here today. So please join me in thanking Margaret Burnham for the work she does. And for putting the event together, and I'll turn the podium back over to her.
Thanks so much. So now, we are going to hear from Dr. Wilkerson in due time, but we're going to set her up. Because we're first going to hear the stories of two of our clients who illustrate what her book is all about. These are folks who would be in respectively Mississippi and Arkansas, but for the violence that they faced. These are folks who weren't pulled out, but were pushed out of their homes. And our first guest is Earl Lipsey. I'm not going to tell you his whole story because it is in the book, but he will be speaking with us with his lawyer, a 3L here at the law school, Gavi Farber. Let me just tell you this one piece of the story, which is Gavi picked this case up a year and a half ago. It involves a 1965 killing in Mississippi. And there was simply a line on the FBI cold case list. There was a name on the FBI cold case list. And I said to Gavi, why don't you see what you can find out? And she, along with another student, Elise, who's also here, dug up all of the records in the case and ultimately located someone we think may have had something to do with the murder, and also located the most important witness in the case who had not spoken to anyone about the events since he spoke to the FBI in 1965. That's Earl Lipsey. And Mr. Lipsey, when we called him on the phone and we said, we really want to talk to you about the murder of Freddie Lee Thomas, what he said to us is, I've been waiting for this call for 40 years. And here he is. I welcome Earl Lipsey.
Good afternoon. My name is Gavi Bogan-Farber, and as Professor Burnham said, I've been working in the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project for the past several months, and I am here to introduce Mr. Earl Lipsey, who I got to know through our work in the Freddie Lee Thomas case. I'm going to start by giving a brief summary of the case, and then we'll let Mr. Lipsey tell his story. On August 6, 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. 2 weeks later, Freddie Lee Thomas's body was found on a rural highway outside of Sidon, Mississippi. He was 16 years old. The authorities convened an all-white coroner's jury, and a local doctor conducted an autopsy. Only hours after Thomas's death, the coroner's jury ruled the killing a hit and run, and law enforcement conducted no further investigation. Thomas's family was not contacted until after the authorities determined the cause of death and closed the case. Many members of Sidon's black community believed Thomas had been murdered. They believed this in large part because there was an eyewitness who saw a body thrown out of a car and run over in the same place where Thomas's body was found. Elizabeth Aronson, a civil rights worker in Sidon at the time, helped organize a letter-writing campaign to President Lyndon B. Johnson. 99 members of Sidon's community wrote letters to the president, some alleging that Freddie Lee Thomas was killed to intimidate members of the black community from registering to vote. Then Ms. Aronson and Mr. Frank Bass, Thomas's brother, took those letters to Washington, D.C. As a result of this letter-writing campaign, the FBI opened an investigation into Freddie Lee Thomas's death, but never made any arrests. Mr. Earl Lipsey, one of our honored guests this evening, was 15 when Freddie Lee Thomas was killed. He was involved in civil rights activities and was one of the people who heard the eyewitness tell the story of what he had seen on the highway that night. Mr. Lipsey's family lived and worked on the plantation owned by the family of one of the suspects in the killing. Mr. Lipsey, first, thank you so much for traveling all this way from Kansas to share your story with us.
Thank you.
And maybe we can start if you could tell us a little bit about your involvement in the civil rights activities as a young teenager in Sidon.
Well, I'm going to introduce myself again. My name is Earl Lipsey. I was born and raised in Sidon, Mississippi. I was born in Tula, kind of funny name, T-C-H-U-L-A, Mississippi, on Highway 49, the very place that Freddie Lee Thomas was killed. I started working with the movement at an early age, and I realized at an early age that I had some artistic ability. And anyway, one of the things that I did for them was draw flyers and posters, and when we were going to go out and sit in, try to segregate some of these places that would feature out of the back door. And so I would put my name on it. Yeah, I would put my name on it because I wanted people to know that I could draw. I couldn't do too much else. I could draw. And so I would put my name on everything I drew proudly, and at the same time I was telling them who I was, that I might be one of their suspects in some way, and believe me, that's how it happened. I started getting rotten eggs thrown at me, and then, a whole bunch of things. He just got shot at, and all these things, and I'm wondering, as a child, do I have to go through this? And with a parent that meant everything that I was a single parent, everything that was surrounded by her, and it was kind of hard and to really just start up and move around the next day. And when you expect your parents to be in America, someone that can protect you from, feed you, protect you, and not going to allow anybody to hurt you. But in Mississippi, parents didn't have that right. They didn't have that right. And another one of the little things that I drew on, it was that I couldn't beat nobody. I didn't have no gun. I couldn't shoot nobody, even though I wished I could have. I learned how to cuss. I learned how to use vulgarity. I couldn't hurt you, but I could cuss you. My mom was so afraid for me. She said, "Earl, be quiet, son." She told me that you keep this up, you won't live to be 12 years old. And who want to be 12 years old in this? I mean, you couldn't go no. I mean, when you walk on the sidewalk, you had to get off the sidewalk if somebody white was approaching you, and you always had to watch your back. And you can't go no place alone at night. If a light shine on you, you was a guider. I don't know if you know that word. You was a guider, so they got you. And so most black people, they would use we don't have big paved areas like this. You can go for miles and don't see grass. No such place in Mississippi. Grass everywhere. They don't have no top roads and all that stuff. So if you use the ditch to hide yourself from lights, because you never know who's behind the lights. And often that black people that walk by themselves at night, the same thing that happened to Freddie Lee Thomas. As a matter of fact, when they began to investigate and look for and found out what was going on with this, they found like 11 or 12 other black men that had been killed, nobody knowing how they got killed, or so forth. And before that, there were these 3 civil rights workers, one from Columbus, Mississippi, and the other 2 was from New York. And they was down to do the same thing that most of the people, like Liz Fosco, that helping people to learn how to vote. Don't run because people tell you don't vote, because that's the first thing they will tell you. Look, you're not going to vote, and if you lived on that man's plantation, you weren't going to vote, and if you did, you had some repercussions to deal with.
And maybe you could tell us why you left Mississippi.
Well, like most people left Mississippi, they use it as the cover of night to leave the plantation. You can't just up and tell the person that, hey, I'm going to move. I don't like the way you do business. I don't like the way you treat me. You be hanging from the next tree. And so people would know that their families is in danger if they say, I'm going to leave. They kill your baby. You kill your dogs, your hog, if you got any, kill your food, that destroy it. And that's how it was. And you just up and say, I'm gone. I'm done with this. Nope, you owe that man your life. And you work sharecropping, and in the end of the year, you owe more than you did when you started. So with the onset of all of these things happening, they knowing who I am, I'm drawing, writing, doing the posters and so forth, it really became dangerous for me to stay in Mississippi. And my poor mom was a maid and working for the very people who did this thing to Freddie. And I had grown up, in a sense, from 5 years old with Jimmy Hooper, the plantation owner's son. And he would come and get me for his son to dominate me, let him know how to feel to, and I whoop his butt every time. He was like 2 years older than me, and big, thick, and heavy. I had to break sticks for a living. I had to cut wood and chop wood. I was skinny, but I was a scrapper. But anyway, knowing that my life was threatened, I talked to my mom, and she said, Earl, the best thing we know we can do is, I can't send you to your aunt. You don't have any. I had no place else to go. And I know that every year, twice a year, there's a bus that leaves Greenwood going someplace with migrant workers. And I happened to had to ride one of those buses. I didn't have no other choice. So my mom gave me every little penny that she had, and I got on that bus. And she wished me well, hugged me, patted me on the back, and I got on the bus. And Lord have mercy, I asked, man, where are we going? He said, well, we're going to Prime Tobacco. I said, where is that? He said, North Carolina. And I said, what part of Mississippi is that? I didn't know. I really didn't know. But anyway, I got on this bus, and it was an arduous thing. We had flat, and we stopped in Atlanta, Georgia, and we was there for about 3 days. I had about $60 when we left Georgia I didn't have a penny, and still had 2.5 more days to go. I got to North Carolina, and they stopped at a Buy Right supermarket, and it was about 12 o'clock at night, somewhere about that. And we all peeled off the bus. Most of these migrant workers, they already knew who they was going to be going and work for. I was a newbie. I didn't know. I was just out there. And I'm standing there waiting for somebody to say, come on with me. And all of a sudden, everybody was gone. And I was at this Buy Right supermarket in Stokesdale, North Carolina. I don't know what part of Mississippi that was either, but that's where I was. I didn't know nothing about this place, period. And there was a big fence, tile fence they had where they store their Coke crates, the crate they put soda pop in. So I saw this car coming down the road. So I haven't been out of Mississippi long enough to not hide. So I ran and hid. I ran and hid behind this building, inside that little structure where they had to put their waste and or store their crates for their bottles. And I went back there, and so this green truck pulls up, light shining bright right past me. I'm stooping down under by the crates, and he stopped. He was really coming to pick up somebody to go work for him. And he got there and nobody was there but me. And he first thing he wanted to do was relieve himself. And so he walked around to urinate, and I'm trying to, he's getting too close, so I'm moving, and he hear me. So he come back to investigate. He said, hey boy, what's wrong with you? You know, so I told him I was on that bus that came. He said, where is everybody then? So he wanted to know where he was going to get his hands at the people that was going to work for him, and that was the only thing that was left. And I'm so afraid, this little man, he's about this tall, and he's about this wide, and he had rosacea everywhere. He was just red, and he looked like he had just drank 4/5 or something. But he started trying to. I was furious. I was scared. I thought I met the Ku Klux Klan himself finally, and he said, "Son, come on, don't cry. You're gonna be all right," you know, and start talking to me like that, you know. I said, in my mind, I know a lot of black men went to their death behind the same little come on. But anyway, this man really was my rescue. This man, today I would call him Daddy if he was still here. Burton Dalton, I'll never forget him. I stayed with him for about 7 years till I went into the military at 22. And this man wouldn't accept none of the racist stuff that were in my presence. He really protected me like I was a son to him. And I realized that it shouldn't have taken all of this. All white folks ain't no Ku Klux Klan. They all belong to that gang. And you know, it was a hard thing for me to come to that place that because I always felt that some suspicion. Why you gonna let me live in your house? You know, why would you do that? Well, this man had 4 sons, no daughters, but 4 sons. And they all had grown up and moved out of the house and so forth. And he had all this to do by himself, his whole farm and everything. And so he asked me, he said, well, Earl, since you're from Mississippi, do you know somebody would come? You know, he said, I pay their way. And that's what he did. After about 2 years, me staying in his house, finally I had some faces that I knew that came, and we all lived in the house together. But I left Mississippi at night to save my life. That was my reason for leaving Mississippi in the way that I did.
So I am so sorry, but that was really beautiful. And I'm the time Earl's going to be around for the rest of the evening, so I hope you'll get a chance to chat with him, because we only heard, the first eighth of his story, but you could tell he's getting into it, so, he'll carry us until about 8 o'clock. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Earl, and thank you, Elaine Crabtree, Earl's wife, both from Kansas City, for coming up to join us. And next, we'll have, you read the story about Isadore Banks, who was murdered in 1954 in Crittenden County, Arkansas. And a number of our students have worked on his case. We were down there recently in Crittenden County to do some investigation and to talk to some witnesses. And one of the students, Jared Milrad, was with me. We got to know each other real well. We're still talking. We're still talking. But one of the people we saw and met with was Isadore Banks' son, James Banks, who has traveled with us, who has traveled with his wife to also Elaine Banks from Memphis to be with us today. So Jared, the Banks lawyer, and Mr. Jim Banks, thank you so much both for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Burnham, for that introduction. We are still friends. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to talk with Jim Banks here in front of all of you, and he's made the long trip to come up here. As Professor Burnham mentioned, we had the opportunity, a couple of students and Professor Burnham and I, to go down to Crittenden County, Arkansas, where Mr. Banks is from, his father was from, and to talk with Jim as well as some other family members and other folks down there. And I wanted to just start by giving you a little bit of background of how really Isadore Banks' life, briefly. I'm sure Jim could add to that. And then to turn it over to Jim, and we'll go through a bit of his travels and own migration that he made after his father's death. Isadore Banks, as was mentioned, was killed in 1954, but he himself was a migrant farmer, originally from the South as well, moved to Marion along with many other black folks at the time, and really became a prominent landowner in the small town of Marion, Arkansas, right near Memphis, Tennessee. He was a World War I veteran. He and a few other men brought electricity, literally laid the lines, power lines, to bring electricity to eastern Arkansas in the 1920s. He had several children. He was married, and he, interestingly, which you might hear more about tonight, he started something called a Grant Co-op Gin. And at the time, he was a cotton farmer, and the black landowners in that community couldn't really sell their crops, and were discriminated against by the white farmers in that community. So literally across the street, and to this day you can still see it when you go down to Marion, he started a gin, black gin, across the street from the white gin, and was known very well in the community for doing that. So that it was speculated as one of the reasons possibly that he was murdered in June 1954. He was found, his body was burned, mutilated, he was tied to a tree, and to this day justice unfortunately has not been brought, although we continue to work on this case, and the FBI has this case on its cold case list, which is actually why this case was brought to us a few years ago. So why don't we start, if you don't mind, Jim, with talking a bit about how you felt as a child. You were, I believe, 11 years old at the time when your father was killed. And if you wanted to give some more background on yourself, feel free.
I will do that. First, let me thank Dr. Burnham and Nessa Madden, and you, of course, for all the work that you've done in respect to my father. I was born in Marion, Arkansas, February 18th, 1943. And when my father was killed, my reaction was, at first, I absolutely felt nothing at all. And one of the reasons why I refused to feel anything is because I felt very guilty because I had wanted my father to disappear, because my father and I never got along at all. We were not friends. And I felt that my father was very wealthy, and he caused, because of that, there were not lots of black wealthy men, so he had plenty of suitors, and he took advantage of that, and that caused my mother a lot of pain, and I felt that pain that she felt, and so I disliked him very much as a result of that. So my reaction was, at that time, was more concern for my mother, because when my Uncle Norman came, we saw him coming, I knew something was wrong. However, I didn't know exactly what was wrong, but I knew it was something very serious by the expression on his face. And he told my mother that they had found my father, because my father had been missing 2 weeks. My father was often leave early in the morning and come home there late at night, but he always came home. So, but for like 2 weeks almost, he didn't come home. So we knew something was very serious, and nobody saw him, nobody could find him. And so when my Uncle Norman came and told my mom fainted. And I'd never seen anyone faint before, so I thought she was dead. And that just like freaked me out completely at that particular point. There was no immediate migration to the north like a lot of people did. That we left eventually in 1956, and my mom says that it was mostly because of me, because I was the kind of kid that was not going to accept subservience in any way. And of course she knew that because I was too much like my father.
Right.
And that was might have been one of the reasons why that he might have been killed, because he was not the type of person that would kowtow to anyone. He would always stand up, and he was determined that he'd be a man. And if there was anything that he taught me, it was that I was to be a man, and I adhered to that. My mother was pregnant with my baby brother Calvin at the time my father was killed, and my Uncle Norman and his family left immediately and moved to a town called England, Arkansas.
And they received threats as well, so they actually were forced out in a sense as well.
My Uncle Norman owned lots of land too at the time, and when he moved to England, Arkansas, he built a very beautiful home there and bought a boat. He and my Aunt Alta went to church one Sunday and came home, and the house had been burned to the ground along with the boat. My Uncle Norman felt like they followed him to England, and he was really never the same after that. He moved into what was called in the South a shotgun house, and there he lived until his death in that small house as a result of that. And also, the reason why we did not leave immediately, my mother was trying to find out what and who may have killed my father. So she had many people investigating, but nobody was able to find out anything. They either disappeared or they just
Wouldn't talk.
Right. And of course, there's a lot of fear there naturally when that kind of thing happened.
But you ultimately were forced. You left, you said, before your mother actually had a chance to leave, correct?
Yes. Well, no, my mother and I, we all were left together.
Right.
We left together in 1956. We left in 1956 together. My mother also, my father had an insurance with New York Life. My mother received a check from New York Life, but her name was misspelled on it. So she sent it back and never received it again. We had some people, I had one of my friends who had gone to work for New York Life in the early 2000s to check to see what happened, and someone in the 90s, 93, somewhere along in there, had cashed the check. And we're not really sure who that might have been, but I suspect that it might have been my cousin John, but not really sure. I mean, you can see he would have been the only one that would probably know. Unfortunately, John is dead.
Right.
So there's really nothing I can do about it.
We're hot in the trail of that.
Yeah, stop that.
Right.
When we moved to Chicago, we moved to the south side of Chicago, which was then most blacks were more or less concentrated in that area. So we moved to 6356 Normal Boulevard in Chicago, and there I attended Inglewood High School because I'd just gone into the 9th grade. My mom says that one of her reasons for moving as well was that because of me, but she didn't want me to become endangered as a result of my attitude. She felt it was pretty dangerous for me to be. And my grandmother always said that, that I was impotent. And that was eventually going to get me killed.
Right.
So my mother felt that it was best, to try to get me out at that time.
But you said, Mr. Banks, that you lived really in segregated Chicago at the time.
Yes, Chicago was extremely segregated, and there are really, I'm sure, until this day, many parts of Chicago was segregated. There was an area called Cicero that was probably equivalent to Mississippi, and it was in every sense. And although they were migrants themselves, but there was that dichotomy between them and us at that time. Yes, that was one of the things that we had to endure there. Inglewood High School was primarily an all-black school at that time. There were no whites at Inglewood High School. So my mother divorced my stepfather because she was looking for an epitome of my father. He was not able, I guess, that's my thinking, is that he was not able to support her the way she had always been accustomed to being supported. My stepfather was just a laborer. He didn't have that kind of money. And I think that might have led to some of the problems that they were having. Not certain of that, but I believe that may have been some. So when she divorced my father, she moved to Champaign, Illinois, and took a job at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Illinois. Prior to that time, she had taught in the public school system there, and had worked at Cook County Hospital there in Chicago. So while moving to Champaign, she took a job at the University of Illinois in the Department of Horticulture. She was a home economics major, and so she was there. And so we lived there in Champaign. I went to school there. My grandfather got ill, very ill, and my grandmother asked if I would come home to help her take care of my grandfather. And my mother was very hesitant to let me go, and I talked her into letting me go, and she said, because that was, in 1955, a kid by the name of Emmett Till had been killed in Mississippi, and many parents would say, that was like a nightmare, particularly for those who lived in the North and were sending their children south. Right. So my mom had real reservations about that. But when I came back, and I promised her, I won't get in trouble if you just let me go, because I loved my grandparents dearly. I said, if you let me go, I won't get in any trouble. Just let me go. Well, when I got there, two of my friends, Dick McCauley and Raymond Frazier, we went to the Dairy Queen, which was white. And we had an area for blacks to buy, an area for whites, and the blacks was on the side and the whites were in front. So we went to the front.
And this was your first time back in Arkansas after your father's death?
This was the first time after I promised my mother that I would not get in trouble. So we went to the front of the Dairy Queen, and I asked for an ice cream cone, and she said that we don't serve niggers on this side, go around on the other side. And I said, well, we're not asking for niggers, we just want an ice cream cone. And so she called the manager. And the manager came, and when he saw us, he called the school, because this was on our lunch hour. He called Mr. Jackson, who was the principal of the high school, and said, he has 3 little niggers down here that's causing trouble, and if you don't come and get them, they may get in trouble.
Right.
So Mr. Jackson came and got us, told us to never do that again, because he couldn't protect us, because that was usually, and they couldn't, really, if they wanted to. They simply just were not in a position to do that. After graduation, almost all of my friends, except for about 3 or 4 of them, migrated to Chicago, California, Detroit, all of those places north, except for about 3 of them who remained.
And so, because we're short on time, if you could maybe go to the point when you went back to essentially Arkansas and to Memphis, if you could just close with that and how that felt to go back later in life.
Yes, well, in order to get there, I have to first say that I got married. I was in College, which is Agricultural Mechanical Norm, which is now University of Arkansas.
Right.
But I was there, and I met my wife, and we were married. And I moved back to Chicago. And then in 1983, that was in 1961. So in 1983, I came back to Arkansas because I took a job with the National Education Association, and I was to be director of their Arkansas affiliate in Little Rock. And so I came back there, and my office was in West Memphis, so I lived in Marion.
Right.
And I lived on the land that my father once owned, which was now a suburb, which we never found out what happened to the land until this day, except for you were successful, Dr. Burnham and you were successful in finding 383 acres of it, I believe, that had been given to my Uncle Norman. The other was never found. So when I came back and lived on that land in 1983, I ran for the House of Representatives, State House of Representatives, and I lost about 300 votes. And those votes were primarily stolen from me in a small town called Earl. And okay,
You started getting into the stolen.
okay.
There's more to hear.
Anyway, just to end it very quickly, my campaign manager, who was investigating it, was killed. We believe he was killed, but he died of a diabetic coma about 2 weeks after we started the investigation. So.
I'm so
Thank you.
sorry. We don't have
Thank you.
really wonderful story. So we're going to hear now from Judge Wright. Yes. Judge Wright is former Chief Justice of the Roxbury District Court and now a Commissioner of the Boston Licensing Bureau. But most importantly, he's perhaps the best baritone in Massachusetts. One of his last performances was at Fenway Park, the opening anthem at Fenway Park. So, hey. Thank you so much for joining us.
so much, Judge Wright, proving that lawyers have other talents, or at least some lawyers do. We'll hear from Judge Wright again at the close of this program. And now I'm about to bring our guest speaker to the podium, but before I do that, I want to be certain to thank those who've made this program possible, those who worked so hard to bring us all here together today, and that would include the Spectra Asala, who is the event planner for the law school and who helped you get into the room or held you back from getting into the room for a few minutes, and Nancy Madden, who is the program manager of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Program. Nancy, stand up, please. Nancy. And the members of our planning committee, Dean Betty Freeman and Janice Galligan and Rick Doyen. Thank you so much to all of you for. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce Isabel Wilkerson. This is a book that deserves to be on every shelf. Professor Wilkerson has garnered awards and honors galore for the book. It is a National Book Critics Circle Award winner, a New York Times Top 10 Best Book of the Year. And it feels like we're really on the beginning of a journey ourselves because, as we sit here today and get ready to hear her talk, because this book will be a film, it will be a play, it will have many, many iterations, and we're really here just at the beginning. So just bear with me for a minute while I tell you a little bit more about her. I know you're anxious to hear her own voice. Isabel Wilkerson, as Chicago Bureau Chief of the New York Times, won the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing for her coverage of the historic floods in the Midwest and for her profile of a 10-year-old boy growing up with a man's obligations on the south side of Chicago. The award made her the first black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in journalism and the first black American to win for individual reporting in the history of the Pulitzer. She also won the George Polk Award for her coverage of the Midwest and was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She spent most of her journalism career at the New York Times, and her work has been widely anthologized. She has come to be known for nonfiction narratives that combine the disciplines of journalism and ethnography. She has written extensively on issues of social policy and the human condition, as well as on the major stories of the day, such as the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the challenges of upward mobility for the New York Times 2005 series, and for its book, Class in America. She has lectured on narrative nonfiction at universities, newspapers, and professional writing workshops throughout the country, in Canada and in Denmark, and has conducted narrative writing seminars at the Nieman Foundation across the river at Harvard. At the university level, Isabel Wilkerson has served as the James M. Cox Professor at Emory University, the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University, and the Krieger Wolf Endowed Lecturer at Northwestern University. She currently is a Professor of Journalism titled, but tell us what at Boston University. She is a board member of the National Arts and Journalism Program at Columbia University. The John Simon Guggenheim Foundation awarded her a fellowship to advance the research on her wonderful book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And the book is the first major piece to chronicle on a national scale the migration and its aftermath, published by Random House in 2010. And I will add, because I've read the wonderful book, that her family is from Rome, Georgia, and that she is an alumna of Howard University.
Good evening. It is such an honor to be among kindred spirits who are working in this important endeavor of rectifying omissions in our history, which is what I spent 15 years attempting to do. I'm so honored to be sharing this program with Earl Lipsey and with James Banks, who have lived what I've written. Thank you so much, Professor Burnham, for bringing me here, and for all of the organizations and parts of Northeastern University that were responsible for getting me here. I am so honored, I want to say, to be among students who are devoting so much of their work toward social justice. There cannot be enough people working on this, because there are many, 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 many cold cases, and as you look at the cold cases, you come across even more. And I experienced the pushback and the fear that you encounter when you go into these worlds. Even now, decades later, people do not want to talk, which is one of the reasons why I call this the topic of my book, The Warmth Brothers' Sons, really about one of the greatest underreported stories of the 20th century, in part because the people did not want to talk about it. In some ways, they were suffering from post-traumatic stress, if you think about it. These people, as you heard earlier today, were in many respects living under a caste system that is almost impossible for us to imagine now. It cannot be overstated, the sense of subjugation and repression that the people lived under every day. And one of the things I set out to do in working on this book was to try to recreate it, try to make it come alive for people, because this is history, but it's living history, but it's just far enough away. And we've made so much progress in this country that in some ways we have to work hard to remember what it was to live like in that era, because so much progress has actually been made. But it is not that long ago. We have people, many, many people are alive today who lived through that period of time and carry with it the scars and the wounds of what it means to live under a caste system. This caste system was so extreme that that it was actually against the law. I'm going to give you some examples. It's actually against the law for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. Was against the law. Someone must have seen a black person and a white person playing checkers together in some town square in Birmingham, and maybe they were having too good of a time, and someone decided that we could not have that the entire foundation of Southern civilization was in peril, and we cannot have that. And they actually wrote that down as a law. In courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. Here we are in a school of law. Imagine that. This was actually, there had to have been, and I could get into this a little bit, there had to have been a compelling force to drive people to create a system such as this, because it was actually inconvenient and not pragmatic. So what happened was, and the way that I found out about this particular aspect of what we call Jim Crow, is that I ended up spending a lot of time with newspapers of the era to try to recreate this. And I should remind you that I spent 15 years in the book. This is my copy of the book, which may look different from yours. It looks 15 years old, doesn't it? It's really worn out. But if this book were a human being, it would actually be in high school and dating. That's how long it took me to finish this. And that's because I really wanted to make this come alive. I interviewed over 1,200 people who were part of this great migration or had lived under Jim Crow, and then I had to go into the archives and see how I could also look for ways to make it come alive that even some of the people who were part of it may not have always realized, because in different states and different counties there were different laws. And so I came across this Jim Crow Bible by looking at the archives of newspapers in North Carolina. And in that, I saw a newspaper article, and the headline had the word Jim Crow Bible, and I'm thinking, the Word of God, the Bible itself was segregated, and how could that possibly be? Now, the story was written not because it was viewed as arcane or bizarre. This was in the 1940s. It was not considered unusual. It was not anything to apologize for. They were not ashamed, nor were they writing about it with any sense of alarm. They were, in fact, writing about it only because that particular day there had been a disruption in the trial because they could not find the Black Bible. Couldn't find the Black Bible, and therefore they had to, the bailiff and the sheriff and the other court officers had to comb the courthouse in order to find this Bible before they could resume the trial. The judge himself said, this is the state of North Carolina, this is the law of the state of North Carolina, find the Bible, and that's what they had to do before they could resume the trial. And that's how I found out about that. There was one other case. I've had the honor of being able to talk about this the book, and about more importantly the people and the movement that fueled this this movement. So many places, and one of my most challenging audiences is high school students. You know, bless their heart, as they say in the South. And that's because they're so delightfully removed from all of this that it's almost incomprehensible to them. And so I have really had to struggle to come up with just the right example that will speak to them. And so I figured out an example when I was speaking in to one group of high school students, and I'm going to share with you that because this is what brings it alive in ways that you know, in some ways, no single law can get to you as this one. And before I tell you what it is, I'd like to ask how many of you, since there are a lot of people who use the T and other public transportation here in Boston, so I'll give you a little bit more time frame in which to consider the question I'm about to ask you, and that is, how many of you within the last 6 months have found yourself driving a car on the road and found that you were about to overtake a car in front of you and decided to pass that car in order to avert perhaps an accident? How many of you have passed someone on the road in the last 6 months? Yeah, that would have been, that was against the law for many African Americans in the South throughout the time of what we consider to be Jim Crow, which began with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and then continued on until essentially the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. It was against the law or against custom throughout many parts of the South for an African American motorist to pass a white driver no matter how slowly that person was going. I would suggest that alone could account for a couple million people being ready to leave right then and there. Because that requires a sense of self-control and patience and fortitude that is beyond most human capacity, if you would think about it. And yet, we marvel at the absurdity of such a thing. This was very real. These were issues and matters of life and death. During the time period that I've described, but particularly during the years of the early part of the 20th century, the first 3 decades of the 20th century, every 4 days an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the caste system that I've described to you. Every 4 days. And the more common reason for those lynchings were not always the more spectacularly reported Emmett Till circumstances that we all know about. The more common causes of lynching were often for very small things in order to make the point that this caste system and this dividing line was not to be crossed in any way, in small ways and in large ways. The most common, there are people who would have been lynched for the accusation of having stolen 75 cents, for having been accused of having stolen a mule, for very seemingly small things. But the most common reason for lynching was for the amorphous accusation of having acted like a white person. That was the most common reason for lynching. So every 4 days, there was a person an African American who lost their life for such a thing. This migration ultimately ended up being a defection then. It ended up being a seeking of political asylum for people who were citizens of this country and had to seek political asylum to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. This is the only time in American history that American citizens felt forced, compelled, or felt that they had no other option but to leave the land of their birth for another part of their own country just to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. No other group of people has had to do that in the history of our country. 6 million African Americans defected the South from 1915, the start of World War I, around the time of World War I, until 1970. It did not end until the ultimate reasons for this defection, meaning the Jim Crow caste system that had marginalized and subjugated them for so long, until that was actually dismantled, and that's when the migration ended. The migration began during World War I, because during World War, well, let me tell you a little bit about why the caste system began. The caste system began, in my view, because the South was built upon the premise, its economy was built upon the premise that there had to be not just a supply of cheap labor, but an oversupply of cheap labor to work the land, to plant, to chop, and the biggest job of all, to harvest the cotton, the rice, the tobacco, and the sugar cane that were the lifeblood of the South. It required massive amounts of hands in order to do that work, and that the people would have to sit fallow for part of the time when there was no need to be working, but they needed to be at the ready when the work called for them. And so therefore there needed to be not just a supply of them, but an oversupply of cheap labor. Those people needed to feel as if they had no options. They essentially were, especially the sharecroppers, were essentially owned still by the people who owned the land. They were really in some ways no better off realistically, pragmatically, practically from their slave forebears. And so that was the reason why this caste system was created. But the caste system came under incredible pressure. I mean, if I should put it this way. The caste system was in place, and the people did not leave in large numbers until World War I. And the reason they began leaving in World War I was because during World War I, it was the North that had a problem. The North had a problem because Europe was at war, and immigrants from Europe who had been working the factories and the foundries and the steel mills and the railroads of the North were suddenly wanting and needing labor, because the immigrants, many of them had returned home to fight the war effort during World War I, and immigration had basically come to a halt here to the United States. And therefore the North had a problem. The North began sending recruiters to the South to begin to recruit African Americans to the North. That means that the first wave of immigrants, of black migrants to the North in large numbers, there had always been, when this migration began, 90% of all African Americans were already in the South. 90% of all African Americans were living in the South at the time this migration began. By the end of it, nearly half would be all over the rest of the country. But that meant that when the North began looking for cheap labor, they went to the cheapest labor in the land, which would have been African Americans, who were in some ways cordoned off and in some ways held hostage in one region of the country. And that's where they went. That means that the first wave of African Americans who came in large numbers came at the express invitation of the North, which if you get a chance to, we'll think about how life has turned out for many people who did migrate and the issues that have been faced in many northern cities. It turned out that the North wanted the labor and the workers, but didn't want the people. Now that gets to be kind of complicated. How do you have the labor without having the people? But that's for another conversation. The issue is that the first wave of people came at the express invitation, and once the North began to recruit, the South did not take kindly to this poaching of their cheap labor. They didn't like it. Suddenly, they didn't like that. And I want to share with you one of the things that is a very short comment that was made by an editorialist in Macon, Georgia, who expressed in some ways the sense of alarm at what was going on. He said, "Everybody seems to be asleep about what is going on right under our noses. That is, everybody but those farmers who have wakened up on mornings recently to find every Negro over 21 on his place gone, to Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Indianapolis. And while our very solvency," listen to the language of the era, "while our very solvency is being sucked out beneath us, we go on about our affairs as usual." So there is a sense of awareness and alarm and urgency about what to do about the cheap labor that had been the foundation of the Southern economy, about the cheap labor leaving. So what do they do about that? Well, the South ended up trying to figure out ways to keep this from happening. And one of the things that they did is they tried to keep the people physically from leaving, which is why, as we heard today, the people had to leave under cover of night. And this is the reason why. Southern authorities would actually arrest people on the railroad platforms when there were large numbers of African Americans holding northbound tickets. They would arrest people from their train seats. So people who had been saving up and planning and hoping to get that ticket, to get to what they perceived as freedom, instead of being able to hand their ticket over to the conductor, there was the sheriff there to arrest them. And since we are in a school of law, the usual reason for that, the law that they would invoke, would be vagrancy laws. The people were not working at that moment. They weren't working because they were on a train trying to leave. So that's true that they were not working, but that was one of the major reasons that they would give for arresting the people. And when there were too many people to arrest, they would wave the train on through, so that people who had been hoping and praying and planning this moment of getting to what they perceived as freedom had to watch that train leave without them and then try to figure out, how now will we get out? The North also had to face additional problems because the South tried to affect and control the demand side of this equation. What the South did was they actually created laws and required anyone who wanted to recruit a single black person to the North, in Macon, Georgia, for example, had to first pay a licensing fee of $25,000 in 1918. That's the equivalent of $500,000 to recruit a single black person. So now, who would pay that now? Who would pay that then? And so those were efforts to dampen the flow of people out of the South. And what it did was only fuel the desire all the more, because people were desperate to get out, and they found whatever way they could. Now, I know that we don't have a huge amount of time, so I want to make sure that I get to some of the impact of this and what are the larger lessons of the efforts of these people and what they did. We heard, from two people who were part of this migration, Earl Lipsey and James Banks. One leaving from Arkansas and another from Mississippi. And when these people left, they often left. This is a universal human story, as the President began our discussion today. This was a universal human story that is in some ways allows us to see that these people are in some ways proxies for someone in all of our backgrounds who had to have done what the people in this book did and people in this migration did just for us to be here today, because obviously most Americans are descended from people who came from some place far, far, far away. Depends on how far in your background you have to go. I mean, how many of us know of or are actually descended from a great-grandmother from Italy or from Ireland who crossed the Atlantic and met and married someone she never would have met otherwise, a great-grandfather from Scotland or from Ireland or from Italy or from Lithuania or from Latvia or from Poland or from Germany or from China or from wherever else in the world they might have come from, and created whole new lineages, and that's exactly what this migration did. This great migration was just as beautifully ordered and predictable as any other migration might be, because that's what human beings do. And in this particular migration, people followed certain routes based upon the railroad lines and the bus routes that were the quickest way to what they thought would be freedom. So there was the East Coast migration, which carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., and to Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and their direct route, the majority of African Americans that you might meet in Boston, there are people from all over, but many, many, many people are from Virginia, often the Tidewater area of Virginia, very specific, and from North Carolina and South Carolina, and that is just what people do during a migration. There was a central migration stream which carried people from Mississippi and Arkansas and Tennessee and Alabama to Chicago and to Cleveland and Detroit and the entire Midwest. And then there was a final stream which carried people from Louisiana and Texas to California and the West Coast. And that's how the people migrated. This migration changed the country in ways that we are still only beginning to really truly ascertain. This was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people in our country signaled recognized and then signaled that they had options and signaled that they were willing to take them. That's the first time in American history that actually happened. It's also the first time in American history that the people in the lowest caste of our country actually had options for their children to do something other than what they had been, than the caste into which they had born dictated that they would have had to have done had they been in the South. So what this does was it's the first time that we have a huge opening up of opportunities to massive numbers of children, of parents who took this great leap of faith into the unknown, leaving the only place that they'd ever known, many of them never having ever been outside their county, their one county in Mississippi, or that one small town in Alabama. Many people had never been outside their one small jurisdiction, much less clear across the country to a place called Minneapolis or a place called Boston. That's a huge leap of faith for people who had never had that opportunity before or had to take a great leap of faith in order to do that. I want to tell you about one example of a family that did this. This is a family in Alabama that they were sharecroppers in the 1920s. They had always wanted to go to there had always been a dream, let's say, of getting out, but they'd never really been able to make it happen. They didn't have money. They were sharecroppers. The mother and the father in this family, they had 9 or 10 kids. The mother and the father in this family had been debating as to whether they should go for months. They had always signaled that they had this desire to go. They had actually named their son, his middle name was Cleveland. His first name was James. So they named their son Cleveland. So Cleveland was what they had on their minds. But they could never get the father was concerned about it. He wasn't certain. The mother was absolutely certain that they should go. The father was still worried and nervous, so they went. Right. So we know who was running that family. They finally got up to this foreign city called Cleveland, as a mother had always wanted. And the little boy was 9 years old. The youngest of the 9 was very weak child. But his first day in school, the teacher couldn't understand him when she asked him what his name was. He said his name was J.C. And so she didn't understand it. And from that moment forward, she called him Jesse. And that is how a man that many of you may recognize got his name. Jesse Owens got his name that way. That was not his name. Never was his name. His name was James Cleveland Owens. But the teacher, because she couldn't understand him, called him Jesse. His parents, his mother and father, never corrected them. I guess they just said to themselves, well, that's what they do to you when you go to the North. They change your children's names. They rename your children. So that was his name, and that's how Jesse Owens got his name. That, just for the record, that never was his name. But what this migration did was these parents, these humble parents with dreams of something better, took this leap of faith, and that leap of faith allowed an entire generation of African Americans who, by law and by definition and by custom, had never been able to be their truer selves, had never been able to be the orthodontist that they always dreamed of because they were out in the field. They never had the opportunity to be the civil rights attorney that they really felt they should be if they were out in the rice field. These are people who have been consigned to one thing when actually inside of them they were actually opera singers wanting to break free. And so this was an opportunity for an entire generation to be something that had never occurred in the history of our country. And what happened to those people? One of those people was Toni Morrison, who would never have been able to become the Nobel laureate that she did, the novelist that she had. Her parents stayed in Alabama partly because in Alabama, at the time that she would have been growing up, it was illegal. It was against the law for a black person to just walk into the library and take out a library book. That was against the law. That means that she would not have been able to have access to the books that are necessary for a person to become a writer. And if you're going to become a Nobel laureate, it's kind of nice to get a book now and then, if you think about it. But her parents had the foresight, the fortitude, the courage to be able to leave, and they went to Lorain, Ohio, and that's where they raised their daughter. Other people who were part of this migration or who benefited the names and aspects of American culture that simply would not exist had there been no Great Migration include such people as August Wilson, whose entire cycle of work, first of all, he wouldn't have existed because his parents wouldn't have met. His mother was from North Carolina. His father was from Europe, and they met in Pittsburgh. His mother and father did. But every single one of his cycle of plays, if you've had a chance to view them, they're all about the Great Migration. They're all about the longing and the heart sickness and the homesickness and the heartbreak of having to, in some ways, divide up families in the way that the migration forced people to do. And who owns the culture, North and South? Every one of his plays is about, did we make the right decision? Whether we stayed or whether we left. All of his plays are about that. Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. She too, her famous play is about what happens in the North to a family when they are there far away outside of Mississippi, now in Chicago in the big city, and the head of the household passes away, and now what will happen to the family? When it comes to music, music as we know it simply would not have existed had there been no Great Migration. 20th century music as we know it would not have existed. And that's starting with jazz, for example, where you have Miles Davis. Miles Davis's parents were from Arkansas, cotton country of Arkansas, went to Illinois, where their son would get the chance and the luxury, really, of being able to spend the hours upon hours upon hours that it would take in order to master his craft. The talent was within him, but as with so many people, millions of unknown people, it went untapped and unrecognized because it had never had the chance to flourish. And yet his parents allowed the opportunity for his to because they left. Thelonious Monk, his parents left North Carolina and went to Harlem when he was 5 years old, where he too had the luxury of being able to practice his music and to take music lessons, which would never have been possible in the tobacco country of North Carolina. And John Coltrane migrated himself at the age of 16 from North Carolina to Philadelphia, where, believe it or not, it was not till he got to Philadelphia that he got his first alto sax. And you wonder, where would jazz be had that man not gotten a hold of an alto sax? Motown would simply not have existed had there been no Great Migration. That's because Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, he himself, his parents migrated from Georgia. They went to Detroit. When he got to be a grown man, he decided he wanted to go into music, but he didn't have the money, the resources to go scouting out the best talent all over the country. So what did he do? He looked around himself, and there he was, surrounded by children who were the first generation out of the South living in the North, first generation. And he saw these children who were growing up with the folk music of the South that had been brought by their parents to the North, the spirituals and the gospel music and the blues music, all of that. They were growing up and they began to recalibrate that and reshape it into something of their own. And among the young people that he saw were these three girls. One was Mary Wilson, and another one was Florence Ballard, and then there was a third one who was as known as much for her personality as her voice, and I think you have an idea who I'm speaking of. We would not know Diana Ross's name had there been no Great Migration. That's because she wouldn't have existed. Her mother was from Alabama. Her father was from West Virginia. They migrated during different years to Detroit, met, married, had her and her sister, and thus a legend was born. Gordy also heard about this very, very large family in Gary, Indiana. 9 or 10 kids. It was the youngest of the 5 boys who was considered the front man and the most talented one among the 5. He was the front man at age 5. And I think you know who I'm speaking of. We would not know Michael Jackson's name or any of the Jackson 5, none of them, because they wouldn't have existed. Their mother was from Alabama, father from Arkansas. They both migrated during different decades to outside of Chicago, met, married, and had all the kids, and thus yet another legend was born. I want to just close with the idea that I hope it inspires me every day when I think about it. It propelled me through the 15 years that it took to write this book, and I hope that it serves as an inspiration for all of us, but particularly for the students who are embarking upon this important work, and that is the power of the individual. You know, we're here to honor the memory of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is obviously one of the most legendary figures of all time, and he made it his life's work to make change for all of us. But when he when he died, he was actually working for the humblest of people one can imagine, if you think about it. He was working, even though he was a Nobel laureate and was a household name, and his picture was on the mantle of almost every African American family in the country. He was still working to help give voice to and equality to the sanitation workers in Memphis. And it was that is where, and it was doing that important work that he lost his life in the service of that. But the lesson of all that is that, and from this migration, is the power of the individual, and he recognized the power of the individual. The Great Migration itself is a great testament to the power of the individual decision. Each of these people, one added to the other, making these individual decisions, just looking straight ahead as to what is the best route for them to get out and to have freedom. One added to another, making millions of people could ultimately change the country. It was the pressure of all of these people defecting that part of the country that forced that part of the country to change, forced the North to deal with a problem that had never been dealt with before. And it was as a result of all of these people, just by their mere existence in the North, putting so much pressure that sent the cameras down ultimately, forced the North to take notice. There had been resistance in the South all along. But it was as if they were trees falling and no one there to hear them. Suddenly, when the North began to take notice and the cameras went down and recorded what had been going on all along, that is when change came finally. So this migration of all these people, this defection and the movement of 6 million people had that kind of impact. And that shows you that if these people could have that kind of impact, if you think about it, these people were able to do what a president of the United States could not do. These people were able to do what the Emancipation Proclamation itself could not do. These people were able to do what both houses of Congress could not do. These people were able to do what the powers that be, North and South alone, could not or would not do. They freed themselves. They freed themselves. And if they could free themselves with so little, they had so little in the way of education, so little in the way of resources, no money at all. Nothing but just their strong backs and their faith that something had to be better someplace far away, and the hope that life would be better for their children. If they could do that with what little they have, then that means that there's nothing that we can't do. All of us are in some ways heirs to what they did. They, by their actions, made life better for all of us. This is not an African American story. This is not even really an American story. It's a human story. It's about human strength and fortitude that really runs through all of us because all of us, on some level, have within us that immigrant heart to leave a place, to go someplace far away for something better. I want to leave you with the words of Richard Wright. This is a passage which informed and gave me the title to this book. And in some ways, he's speaking to anyone who is on the cusp of a great journey, anyone who is on the cusp of the unknown and has to go out there by themselves and hope that things will turn out well. And he wrote, as someone who was part of this great migration himself, leaving Mississippi, heading to Chicago, he wrote, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps, just perhaps, to bloom." Thank you so much for having me.
Professor Wilkerson. Let me just say a few words about where we're going from here. IB Kaliosho will help field a few questions. Professor Wilkerson has graciously agreed to stay for a few minutes and for some discussion. And then we'll head downstairs. Well, first we'll hear from Judge Wright again. He'll close out our program, and then we will head downstairs for a reception. I hope you'll all join us there. And I hope that when you do join us, you'll make sure to check out the presentations that our students will have down there. And our students all have CRRJ. You can recognize them by their CRRJ badges. So thank you so much, everyone. IB and Professor Wilkerson.
Hi, at the time we like to open up questions for all three of our guests. Yeah, do you guys want to come up and sit down? Any questions? Yes.
The question is for Professor Wilkerson, and I'd like to know if in doing your research for the book, if you found any reports from individuals who left the South and came to the North that their conditions therein from the North were comparable, if not worse, than the subjugation they would have experienced in the South.
That's a great question. The answer to the question was, I interviewed over 1,200 people, and did the people that I interviewed, did I find people who found that the situation was worse in the North than in the South? That's what you're asking, is that right? The situation was different. It's different. What they left was formal, openly acceptable delineation between people based upon what they looked like, without apology, and with a sense of that this actually was a good thing to maintain the economy. When they arrived in the North, they came to a place that was unaccustomed to, and actually did not have a plan for how to fit the people into a place that had not really was not accustomed to having the large numbers of African Americans. And so what ended up happening was, ultimately there was actually a higher degree of segregation in the North than there was even in the South. It sounds like an oxymoron, but the reality is that there was an opportunity, that people were segregated in the South, but segregated in every aspect of their actions. They could not. It turned out that, believe it or not, a study was done that showed, by anthropologists, that showed that the average Southerner, black or white, had never so much as shaken the hand of a person of the other race during much of the 20th century up until the 1970s, because that was considered a breach of the caste system on all sides. The caste system actually held everyone back. The caste system actually was a limiting factor, a restricting factor for everyone, even for those who felt that they might have been benefiting from the restrictions. In other words, there are people who might have been the very best of friends who never had the chance to know that, because they never had a chance to know one another in the ways that would have been natural if people had been left to their own devices. In the North, because there was such fear and lack of experience with African Americans in any way, there ended up being flight from the arrival of African Americans. And I'll tell you the story of what happened in Cicero, and I'll leave it to you to decide. You know, this is a book that is a work of narrative nonfiction, which means it's a story of three people, and you follow them from their journey from as children, making the discovery as both of our I feel griots have indicated, that this doesn't, as a child you can feel that this is not right. So it starts out with them as children coming to the realization that the world is a very constricted one, that's absurd and doesn't make sense. It was almost an Alice in Wonderland, everything upside down kind of world, with a tremendous cost to be paid for breaking any law. And it follows them through the decision to leave and the actual journey out, which was very difficult, not easy, the cover of night, often not being able to stop, and then arriving in the North and making a way for themselves. In Cicero, which has come up already, Cicero actually made the news allow you to come to your own conclusion as to what was better or worse, where a family attempted to move into an apartment in Cicero. I had been Chicago bureau chief for the New York Times for years, and I had not known about this case the entire time I was there. I didn't learn about it until I began working on the book. In any case, the family looked like they could be on a cereal commercial. They were right out of Ebony magazine. They were from the 50s. I mean, when people, wore hats and gloves, and that's how this family was. The husband had been a veteran of World War II, and the wife was working as well. He had now had a job as a bus driver, which is considered a good job in the 1950s. This was 1951. They were, because of the order of things in the North, they were paying an exorbitant amount of money for the apartment that they were living in. One of the realities in the North was that everyone was cordoned off into one narrow band or space in every northern city, and wherever you're from in the North or the Midwest, you know that neighborhood, even to this day, because the Great Migration created a kind of social geography, not because of the people themselves, but because of the reaction to the arrival of the people. So they were living in a situation where they were sharing a 2-room apartment. They were a family of 4, 2 little children, 4 and 6, and 5 and 6 rather, and they were sharing with another family of 5. So that was not a good workable situation for the long run. They wanted to get out, and they found an affordable home apartment in Cicero that was much less than what they were paying and had many, many more rooms. It was the way people should be living. When they tried to move in, it turned out that the sheriff met them at the front steps of the apartment building and would not allow them to move in. They then had to get a court order to allow them to move in. With the court order, they then got their belongings in, but by that night, a crowd of 4,000 people, many of them were immigrants, recent immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, had arrived, recent arrivals themselves. 4,000 of them surrounded the apartment building and would not let them move in. When this family, this couple left the premises, left that area, that mob of 4,000 people then went in, stormed the apartment building. They went into that apartment on the 2nd floor. They tore out, they threw out the piano. They broke up the piano that they had and threw that out of the window. They hurled out the sofas and the chairs and the tables. And when they had done that, they then threw out the children's pictures and the wedding pictures for the family. And after they had done that, they then took out the radiators. They yanked the radiators from the walls. They yanked the plumbing fixtures from the walls and hurled them out of the 2nd floor window. And when they had done that, they then set all of those things afire. And they still were not finished because a mob has no rationality to it. They then set fire to the entire building, leaving the white tenants homeless. So that is what happened in one case in the North. And I leave it to you to figure out which would have been better for someone leaving after all that they'd gone through.
Is there any more questions? Yes.
This is for Mr. Lipsy and Mr. Davis. When looking back now, if you go back to when these events happened in the early years, has things changed for you? When you go back and you see these towns, does it look like it was? Does it feel like it was? Or do you see a new place in this?
There has been a lot of changes, and the feeling is different than it was, say, when I was a kid, 11 years old. The kind of fear that existed during that era, you don't really feel that anymore. It's no restrictions in the area where I live. There are no restrictions as where you can live, and many blacks are very prominent and live in the richest of neighborhoods. So, yeah, things has definitely changed. There's been a lot of progress. And so the feeling is quite different than what it was when I was a kid, where there was always that constant fear that you might not make it home alive. Because at that time, for example, my grandfather was visiting some friends of his during the 4th of July weekend, and a group of white kids passed by in a car and just decided to shoot him, and they shot him in the hip. That was a sport, it was funny to them, they just kept going. So Those kind of things now would rarely exist.
For you personally, I mean, do you separate that, or do you still have these memories that you grew up with and see that?
Well, at some point you have to let the memories go, because if you continue to hold on to them, then it tends to destroy you. So, no, I don't hold on to them any longer. Certainly, we are concerned about, would like to find who killed my father, and we would like to get our land back, and we'd like to get our money back, of course, but that may never happen, and that's not something that I'm going to dwell on, and certainly not let it impede my progress in any other way.
And for myself, I lived in a little small place called Sidon, Mississippi, and it was all owned by white people when I left in '65. But going back there again, hearing people that never been there before talk about how bad Mississippi is, and I'm kind of perplexed because I see the same thing no matter where I go. But have they changed? Yes, they have. Black people own the place now. They got banks. They got credit unions. You know, they own stores. They own the white man's plantation that used to own it. So there's a lot of things have changed. But one of the sentiments is this, like she said, that people just don't want to talk. People still feel afraid to talk about what happened in Mississippi and how could a person in 1975 have a slave in their basement and everybody know it and nothing is done about it. And so there's a lot of things changed, but there's a lot of things behind the scenes that you haven't seen, and if you don't go to see for yourself, you'll never see it. But yes, it's changed a lot. But guess what? Racism still is just as bold and bad as it's ever
been. Is there any more questions?
More questions?
Yeah.
And one lady in Quebec.
Yeah, you.
First, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Thank you for singing for all of this. All the students that are involved in the project. It's really inspiring. It's one of the reasons I came to law school here. So enriching. Thank you. As well. I was just wondering, for the two gentlemen sitting in front today, if you had to articulate or let us know which valuable part of this whole experience, like project here, what would that be?
Me, for myself, just getting the opportunity to share my story with, like I said, I've been waiting for 46 years, not 40. A long time. And you know, and I'm sure that there are people who have experienced the exact thing that I have. But then there are also those people who experienced this and they had their blinders on because they don't want to believe. I've had a woman tell me, say, I've never been discriminated against. And she's 12 years older than me. You must have been living in a cave. You're not Mississippi. And this is the reality. Everybody in America is touched by racism, just like drug and alcohol touch everybody. Not just some people, everybody. And it's something that some people embrace and some people just hate they ever born in it. But if my life can be any kind of positive note about what the future is going to look like and what it can be, one for myself, just as he said, if you hang on to those things that that you felt about racism, that to me, I thought that all white folks were prejudiced. I mean, racist, not just prejudice. We all have the ability to be prejudiced to decide whether I like black, green, or blue. But just because you are black, then I do these things against you as a person. So I think if my little short life can do something positive about this thing, one of my things was this: if I held on to that, I would be dead by now. I just, thinking that I had to go up and say, I forgive you. And walk and tell everybody about how I do. But you know what? I know that there's a war that still reigns on, and I'm a soldier. I'm going to be here. I know it is.
I've changed what I was going to do several times in my head because of what's going on. I know, and I thought of doing a part of a song that I wrote, and I usually have my guitar to play, and I wish I had bought it today. I usually keep it in the trunk of my car, but I didn't. But I'm going to do this a cappella. Let's see if I can do it. I've never done this. It's called Black Man. And I recorded it in 1975 on an album I called Friends and Buddies. They say I'm wrong to live without commandments and set my course by not a solid hand. It seems the world requires a strict foundation of formulas, the measure of a man. Were you born your father's child? Have you always been so wild? What degree now do you hold? Would you be a soldier bold? Oh, yeah. They say I'm black, and so I must be crippled, and live with what advantage I can find. It seems the world has set my course down in history, and slavery, persecution tries to shield my mind. I'm not here to be confined. I've a heart and I've a mind. I've 2 feet on which I stand. I am black and I'm a man. So say I'm wrong and laugh at my situation, but turn around and see me before you go. Can't you see that I'm a man? I've 2 feet and I've 2 hands. I've a heart and I've a mind. I'm not here to be confined. Oh,